today's training, we're going to cover a small section of our moving and handling course. We're going to focus on how you would carry out safety checks on the different equipment you would use, like a wheelchair, hoist and a sling. If you'd like any information about our full moving and handling course, you can just get in touch with me after this session. We've adapted our usual classroom training to these live video training sessions during lockdown, so hopefully this small sample course will give you an idea of how those can be delivered. We normally limit our numbers to about 16 people on the videos so that it can be really interactive and you can have conversations with the trainer. Today there's quite a lot of people booked, so we're going to limit the conversation and the questions to the chat box, so you should be able to type those in. Any questions you have as we go, you can type them into the chat box. You'll have myself and Cal in there so we can kind of answer questions. That's him waving, if you can see. We'll answer questions as we go. If there's anything, we can interrupt the training to ask the trainer for anything as we go, and there'll be a Q&A at the very end, so pop any questions in there that we can answer for you. So I think that's me. I'll hand over to our trainer now and we can get started. So over to you, Anne. Thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm Anne, I'm your trainer for today. We're going to be looking today at moving and handling, and with a specific sort of slant on risk assessments and safety checks of certain types of equipment. So today we'll be looking, when we're talking about safety checks, we're going to be looking at safety checks for hoists, slings and wheelchairs, which are things you may use quite regularly, things that you may use once in a while. So we'll just look at the kind of things you need to think about. We're going to look, I'm going to launch a PowerPoint for us now, and we're going to work through that PowerPoint. Right, so today, the aim of today is that we're just going to have a look overall at risk assessments within manual handling and the safety checks you need to complete for equipment before you ever use it. Obviously, you can see that the greyed out areas are our full course. We do a practical element to the course. We'd also go into a lot more into legislation, ergonomics, biomechanics, etc. But today we're going to look at the health and safety relating to moving and handling, and also understand the risk assessments, what we need to do to make sure that you and everyone else affected by your acts are kept safe. Okay. So under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, employers must, as far as is reasonably practicable, now you'll hear me, and it's actually quite difficult to say, you'll hear me use that term quite a lot, as far as is reasonably practicable. It basically means that you're going to do things to ensure that everyone's kept safe, but you're not going to overdo it. You're not going to do something that's grossly disproportionate. Okay, so your employer must keep both you safe and anyone affected by their acts or omissions, and also look after your welfare as well. Okay, so their duties under the Health and Safety at Work Act are to provide safe systems of work, safe use and safe handling, safe storage and safe transport of articles and substances. They must provide you with the appropriate information, instruction, training and supervision. They should provide you with a safe place of work and also a safe working environment with adequate welfare facilities. So that would mean toilet facilities, hand washing facilities, drinking water, for example. That's the kind of facilities your employer must provide for you. Okay. They also have to provide you with adequate first aid facilities. However, under the Health and Social Safety at Work Act 1974, it's not just your employers who have duties or legal duties, it's actually you as well. Okay, and that's really important to remember. Two of the main things are that you must take reasonable care of the health and safety of yourself and anyone else who's affected by your acts or omissions, so things that you don't do or things you don't do correctly, and also to cooperate with your employer and so they can fulfill their legal obligations. So if they put risk assessments in place, it's up to you to follow them. If they've put support plans in place, it's up to you to follow them. If there is, it's up to you, you must attend any training that your employer deems mandatory for your role, and also that if you notice anything that changes within risk assessments, etc., that you report on to somebody who can address that. So we work in a constantly and ever-evolving environment and support and care. So we must remember that it is our responsibility to report changes to your line managers. So the law requires that employers do risk assessments of any operations that they have, or they must carry out risk assessments. Okay, that comes under the Management of Health and Safety at Work Act. The employers have to appoint competent people to do those risk assessments. It can't just be anyone. It shouldn't be somebody new to the role. It shouldn't be someone inexperienced, for example. It's not a paper generating exercise. It's not a tick box exercise. It's an exercise used to keep everyone as safe as possible. Once you do a risk assessment, obviously you should be identifying the hazards and implementing control measures to reduce any risk. And in most cases, it's very hard to eliminate risk. And so we talk again about reducing it to the most reasonably practicable level. Okay. So what makes a competent person? It wouldn't, as I say, be somebody new to the role, new to the company, new to the charity. It's got to be somebody with certain qualities. Those qualities include that they have the appropriate skills to do the risk assessment, that they have the knowledge of the environment, that they have the right attitude, so a can-do attitude with a good critical eye, observant, etc. So a good positive attitude towards risk assessing. Also that they've had the right training, so that they're competent to do a risk assessment, so that they're aware of what a hazard is, aware of what the risk means, etc. And also experience, because with experience comes knowledge of your surroundings, knowledge of potential hazards. If you're new to a job, you won't know as much as an experienced worker. So with that comes a much more comprehensive risk assessment. Now, under risk assessing in manual handling, we talk about ELITE. You might have heard of it called TILE or TILEO, but we talk about ELITE. So if you think about ELITE, your first E is the environment. What are you going in to assess? What are you looking at when you go into a room, for example? You then talk about the load, which is an unusual term when you're referring to, in our case, a lot of the time to people, but it's a generic term. It's anything of any weight or something that you would have to move. So they use a generic term called the load. But when we talk about the load in a manual handling risk assessment, we mean the individual that we may be moving. The I stands for individual capability. Now that's the individual capability of the handler. So the person that will be doing the moving and handling task. There's certain things that we must consider when we think about that person. We are going to look at a bit of a scenario in a minute, and we'll talk through what the kind of things we should be looking at. The T in ELITE is task. What is it you're going to be doing? What do you need to put in place? What are the control measures you should have in place or implement to make sure that that task is done safely? Also, what the final E is equipment. So it's equipment and other factors, any other determining factors that might have to be assessed under a risk assessment. So that's your ELITE. You're looking at your environment. You're looking at the load, which is the individual or the object you would be moving. You're looking at individual capability, and that's your individual capability, the individual capability of the handlers. You're looking at the T, which is the task itself, what are you going to be doing, and you're looking at E, the equipment and other factors. Okay, before we move on to talk about the scenario that we have, just to clarify, people get a little bit confused between the term hazards and risks, and I will try and make it more understandable, but I'm not sure that I'm very good at it explaining it, but I'll try my best. So a good starting point when you're doing a risk assessment is that you walk into a room and you determine what are the hazards. Now those hazards are something that might cause harm. They haven't caused harm yet, but they have the potential to cause harm. You then think about the risks. The risks are the chance, high or low, as to whether that hazard is going to cause harm. So that's the difference between hazard and risk. Hazard has the potential to cause harm. Risk is the chance or likelihood of it causing harm. Okay. The other thing to think about when you're risk assessing is involve the team, involve the staff that are involved in the care or support, partly because they're the ones that are there all the time. They will see things, they'll be able to help you with your risk assessment, but also that they take ownership of it and become involved and see risk assessment not as a sort of negative thing, but as a very positive sort of forward-thinking way of addressing risks that we have. We then have to think about control measures during risk assessments and record them. Okay, so that's what a risk assessment entails. I'm going to show you a scenario. It's a picture scenario here. We're going to be looking at transferring an individual from a hospital bed using a hoist, and we're going into a wheelchair. So that's the general, what do we look at? So you have a look at this first picture. What are our immediate thoughts on that picture? Well, I wouldn't be moving and handling somebody in that environment. So we need to risk assess. We need to look at what we need to do. Firstly, I've walked into that room, I've looked around, I've looked for my hazards. My hazards evidently are, there's a rug on the floor, it's all rucked up, so it creates a trip hazard. I have leads running across the floor, again, another trip hazard, but that looks like a plugged in cable right next to water. So again, you have an electrical hazard. You have a wet floor, so you've got slip hazards there. And not only that, you have your bucket and your mop left out and lying around. So at the moment, that's a completely unsafe environment to be in. Other things to consider during a risk assessment is, have you got good lighting? Is the room too hot? If it's too hot, you might fatigue too quickly. If it's too cold, your muscles may be tense, you may be tense, which puts you at higher risk of injury. Okay. Is there enough space? Have you got room to maneuver around with the hoist? You might look at maybe moving the bedside cabinet so you've got a little more room to insert the sling, for example. Also flooring in the environment. So it looks like a nice flat smooth floor here. So moving a hoist and a wheelchair over that can be quite good. But I imagine if a lot of you work in support and care in the community, you'll be working in people's own homes, and we don't always have the perfect flooring in people's own homes. Carpeting, thick pile carpet can be a nightmare to push a hoist over, so that would need to be risk assessed. Okay, so there's lots of things to think about in your environment. So remember, you're going into your environment, and you should be doing that every day, every time you walk into anywhere new or anywhere you go regularly, to check that there's no specific hazards around. Another hazard is pets. Cats you don't hear them coming, they get in under your feet. Children, dogs, you know, there's lots of other hazards you have to think about as well. So moving on out of the environment, initially we're going to think about the load. So what is it we need to consider? Obviously, the first thing the care support worker here is thinking about is the weight of that load. Now remember that in this instance, it's a person we're going to be moving, but remember that load can equally be a box or an inanimate object, okay? So how heavy is the load? Even when you're using mechanical lifting equipment, they're load rated, so they're weight rated. So you have to use, your person that you're going to be moving cannot exceed the weight rating of the hoist, for example. So you have to consider how heavy that person might be. Also, just by the nature of people, when we use the terms bulky or unwieldy, we might think more of a big box, for example. But if you were thinking about it in relation to a person, they tend to be a little bit more difficult to maneuver. They're not sort of solid weights. They're more flexible. They're more prone to movement and unpredictable movement as well. You might, on a day-to-day basis with a risk assessment, and this is something that should be reported and recorded, is that individuals' conditions can change. You might have somebody who's become unwell, who's got an infection of some sort, and their mobility is reduced, their ability to help you during the manoeuvre is reduced. You might have somebody who's had a seizure and they're more vague, that they're not quite with it, that they might not be able to follow instruction from you as easily as they would normally. So there's lots of things to think of as well. You need to think about, do I have the appropriate aids in place? So if this person is unable to maneuver themselves, stand or weight bear, then we need the hoist. We cannot use a hoist to transfer between rooms or over long distances, so we therefore need a chair, a wheelchair, to transfer them to another room, for example. At that point, you would then have to hoist them into another chair, into their final destination. You would never use a hoist to push people down a corridor. It's unsafe, and equally it's undignified, and it would be contrary to our duty of care as social care workers. The other things to think about is this person in pain? Can they assist you at all? Do you have the right amount of people to do the job? Are there any physical constraints? So does the person maybe have a catheter, or do they have feed-in tubes in place, drains, anything like that? Any physical constraints that you would have to consider before you move them? And also generally, what is the level of ability of the person that you're going to be moving? Okay. The next thing you think about is the I, the individual capability. And remember, that's the individual capability of the handler we're talking about. Does it require unusual capability, so unusual strength? Do you need to be taller? One of the things they say, and I don't know how often it actually happens, but in an ideal world, you should try and get two handlers of the same height, because when you're raising and lowering a bed, for example, you should have a bed at a height that's comfortable for both of you. In reality and in the real world, that is not always the case. We're not able to do that. So an adjustment of the bed height has to be made that makes everyone comfortable in a comfortable position to work without putting excess strain on an individual. You have to consider whether that individual, the handler, are they pregnant? Are they menopausal? Because that actually has implications now. Is it a young person who is more prone to injury? Has that person got health limitations or a history of injury that you need to consider within the risk assessment? Has the individual got the appropriate knowledge to do this task? And also, have they had the appropriate training? Okay, you always check the care and support plan for your risk assessments, manual handling risk assessments, etc., before you would continue on. And your support plan should often tell you what colour loops you should be using for which manoeuvre, etc., if you're using a sling and a hoist. Other things to consider about individual capability are you also wearing the correct uniform or clothing? So it's non-restrictive clothing. Are you wearing the correct footwear? You should have closed-toe shoes, closed-heel shoes that aren't sort of flapping around. You don't want to be putting a hoist with somebody in it over your toe without appropriate footwear on. And again, that you have the appropriate information in place so you would address the supporter care plans. We then look at the task itself. Okay, does it involve, particularly involves twisting? Twisting can be really bad for your back. It puts undue strain on your spine right the way down. Stooping as well will puts your back into that C position that you don't want. You want to maintain that lovely natural S that your spine has. So if you're stooping, you're putting undue pressure on the lumbar region of your back in particular. Think about reach too. And you may have heard that, if you've done training in moving and handling before, the term ergonomics. So it's about fitting that task to you and not you to that task. So in this situation, you can see that there's two support or care workers, and they're able to work either side of the bed. The bed's been moved away from the wall and they can work either side. That means it reduces the amount of reach that people have to do, and therefore excess strain on them. Does the task involve excess pushing or pulling? So you're going to be pushing a wheelchair. You do require extra force to maneuver a wheelchair and to get a wheelchair moving. One of the things to remember with that is that it's not a race, that you should start off gradually and move very slowly until you get that wheelchair moving to a pace that you're happy with. You do not put extra force through it. That puts extra strain on your bodies. And if you have to do that numerous times a day, you will eventually feel it. So take a very gradual, very slow, steady approach with maneuvering a wheelchair. Redesign your environment as required to make the task easier for yourself. Make sure that you've got the correct aids in place. Here we've got the hoist, we've got the wheelchair, we have an electric bed that we can heighten or lower as required, and that you have the adequate staff in place. So before you undertake any task, think about the 3 Ps. You plan, you prepare, and then you perform it. Okay. And that means that you've planned your layout of your equipment, where your hoist is going to be, where you're going to position the wheelchair, and so that you can do minimal movements and minimal time that the person has to remain in the hoist. We're then going on to look at equipment. So what equipment do you need? Well, in this case, we've got the hospital bed, we've got the wheelchair, and we've got the hoist. The hoist obviously comes with slings as well, and we're going to look at safety checks for that. We've got a few videos for the hoist, the sling, and the wheelchair. What you should be very aware of with equipment, though, is that you should do daily visual checks on that equipment to make sure it's safe. Don't just leave it to a sticker to tell you that that equipment is safe. All equipment under the provision and use of work equipment regulations provided by your employer should be fit for purpose. It should be used and for the purpose it was intended. So you wouldn't use a hoist to take out I don't know, an engine out of a car, for example. That's a people lifting equipment. So that's what you use it for. You don't use wheelchairs for races or for standing to change a light bulb. It's to use to transfer somebody or to take somebody out and about. Make sure that your equipment's clean and kept clean. The equipment, as I said, should be used for the intended purpose. You should have the appropriate training before you use that equipment, and you should have somebody who's able to supervise you with the train and the appropriate knowledge on that equipment as well. Also, any further information that you should require, or any information on particular hazards to do with the equipment, you should be given all of that in advance of using any of this. Okay, I'm going to move on now to show you there's 3 videos so that's coming up, and we're going to look at those videos. But before we do, remember that uniforms, etc., can be classed as equipment, as is PPE. So your personal protective equipment at the moment, which is very important. You'd have gloves, you'd have aprons, face masks at the moment due to the current situation, and potentially eye protection, face visors, etc. So PPE is also classed as equipment, so don't forget that when we talk about equipment. Under the manual handling operation regulations then, there's the main thing that they say is that with any manual handling, it should be avoided. That should be the first principle. So under the manual handling operations regulations, avoid any hazardous manual handling. If not, you should assess it, full risk assessment with the view to reducing the risks to the most reasonably practicable level. Okay, so remember, it doesn't have to be disproportionate, but it does have to be addressed, whether it is putting equipment in place, whether it is increasing the number of handlers, etc. The view then would be that that would reduce all risks, again, to the most reasonable practicable level, and that risk assessment would then be reviewed. So once the risk assessment's been done, that it's reviewed very soon after, and so that you can see that it's working, if it needs to be tweaked, if there needs to be changes made to it. And ongoing, it should be monitored, just to make sure that nothing happens. And it's your responsibility to report and record on if there's any issues in the service that need to be addressed, because often your line manager isn't the person that's seeing that individual as often as you. So remember, you're a really good source of information to address any concerns with the risk assessments. And also another control measure is that you attend manual handling training, that you think about good practice, that you're aware of your legislations, you're aware of your safety checks and equipment, and also that you're aware of your responsibilities under the Health and Safety at Work Act. Okay. I think that is us pretty much finished for today. I'm just going to go over a summary, and then what we're going to do is a little poll again. Now, it's a 5-question poll, multiple choice, very simple. It's anonymous, and it's really just to see that you've learned for yourself. I'll go over the answers at the end. In summary then for today, we looked at the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, the employer's duties, which is keeping everyone safe within their workplace and anyone that might be affected by that. And also your obligations, that you keep everyone that's yourself and everyone that's affected by your acts and emissions as safe as you can. And that you report and record anything regarding risk assessments. Under the the Management of Health and Safety at Work Act, or regulations, that employers must do risk assessments. So they must do risk assessments of their operations, and if to do those risk assessments, they should appoint competent people. So remember SCATE, competent people are skilled, they're knowledgeable, they have the right attitude, the appropriate training, and they have the experience to know what they should be looking for. So once the competent person's in place, they would then carry out a manual handling risk assessment. Remember, we talked about ELITE. You might, as I've said, hear it as TILEO, but we talk about ELITE. Your environment, you check your environment. You think about the load that you're going to move, whether it be an inanimate object or a person. You think about your individual capability or the individual capability of the handler. You think about the task itself. Does it need extra equipment? Does it need extra people? What exactly does it involve? Does it need extra considerations for people who have injuries or who are pregnant, for example? And also then look at the equipment you need and the safety checks that need to be done on that equipment. Once you've done all your risk assessment, you've done all your safety checks, you have to think about control measures. There's no point in doing a risk assessment and identifying hazards unless we put control measures into place. And remember, under the manual handling operations regulations, the first principle is that we should avoid all hazardous manual handling. And if we can't avoid it, we should reduce it to the most reasonable, practicable level. That's everything I've got to share with you today. So I think, thank you all for listening, taking the time to pop in and see us. And I think we're going to do a bit of questions and answers. If anyone's asked any questions, I'll pass over to Jo and we'll chat through them.
Yeah, that's great, Anne. Thanks very much. There's a few questions in here which I'll get to. So the first one is, Anne-Marie's asked, how often should you attend moving and handling training?
Now, it is a good question. It's actually, the Health and Safety Executive doesn't specify any actual dates. It should be done by your employer determining how often they deem fit for you to attend training. Generally, as a rule of thumb, most people attend manual handling training annually. It's kind of good practice just to keep up to date with your skills, to keep up to date with any new legislation, etc. But the Health and Safety Executive doesn't specifically give dates for training.
Yeah, there's no
requirements.
set guideline, I know, because it's one that we wondered when we started
Yeah.
the agency side of the business, because we always have to train our own staff, which is where Trust Care training came from in the first place. We just do it annually because there wasn't a definitive answer, and we thought, well, let's err on the side of caution and just do it every single year. And then that way we know we're covered. Right, so the next question, Grace has asked, should we be using SCATE and ELITE in Scotland?
Should we be using SCATE and ELITE in Scotland? I think anyone doing a risk assessment should be skilled, knowledgeable, with the right attitude, training and experience. And I think ELITE is any form of manual handling risk assessment, whether it's TILEO, TILE, ELITE. It's following just a prescription to do a risk assessment. So it's given you an overall guideline as to how to follow, what you should be looking at, and how you should be addressing any ongoing issues or concerns that you might have.
I suppose it's worth saying we're in Scotland as well. We only actually operate in Scotland. We do all our training in Scotland. So everything that we're talking about here today is specifically about Scotland and might be relevant to other places as well, but certainly in Scotland. Anything we've covered today or any of other training sessions is what you should be doing. I think there was just one more question so far anyway. Pop in any more if you get them. Robert's asked if there's a video regarding safe lifting of objects. I can probably cover that one myself because I organise all the training and stuff. So we don't have a video on safe lifting of objects purely because we cover it in our full session. So today is just a sample session to give you an idea of the sorts of things that are covered in our normal training. So so we don't have a video specifically about that, but you can get in touch with me and we can have a chat about a proper full-on training session. We can cover it off. I think that's all the questions. Oh yeah, Anne-Marie just in the chat is confirming to Grace that she's a trainer in Scotland and uses SCATE and ELITE as well. So yeah, there you go. That's all the questions for the minute, I think. Is there anything else, Anne, you want to cover off?
I think that's it, unless anyone had any other questions. I think that's it. It's a very sort of a brief introduction to sort of risk assessments, etc. Obviously, the full course, we cover an awful lot more about legislation, about what you should be looking at. We go into a bit more detail, and obviously there's practical aspects we look at as well. So yeah, it was just to give you a little taster today and an idea of the kind of things you should be doing and should be looking at as on a daily basis. I think we've got to think about risk assessments as not being scary, but something that we do as a norm. We do it as whenever we cross the road. We do it when we walk into any office space or new house that we go into support. We're doing informal risk assessments. So it's just to think about that.
It's just, that's it. It's just to get you thinking about different scenarios and different environments you might be in, like the picture scenario there with the bucket and the rug and the electrical cord. I hope you never walk into a room and that will be what you're expected to do your moving and handling in. But it's just about thinking about potential risks and what you might come across in different environments, and I suppose not getting complacent about anything as well.
Yeah,
especially
absolutely.
moving and handling.
And there's a last minute question just come in from Richard there. I don't know if you guys saw that.
Oh, no, I've not seen it. Thanks, Gal. What has been the, I'm not sure, is that approach? I think it's just a typo there. Sorry, Richard. I think, what's the approach for doing more training remotely, I think is what you're asking.
Or the uptake. Well, we can tell you as soon as the Care Inspectorate started inspecting again, it just went back to normal. That's pretty much as soon as the things changed.
He says yes, uptake. There you go. Thanks, Richard. He's just typed in. Sorry, Gal, go on.
I just butted out there. Sorry. over to you guys. I'll be quiet.
No, yeah, just to agree with you though. We had, when the lockdown started, obviously everyone was well, panicking obviously and focusing very much on their internal policies and like keeping the home or the unit or wherever they were safe, which is exactly the right thing to have done. Training took a bit of a sidestep, but then a lot of new people are kind of joining the care sector, which has been fantastic. The recruitment that we've seen ourselves has been really, really good. People are coming back into care from maybe never having done it or having done it 10, 15 years ago, just to kind of support everybody at the moment. So with that, you need more training. So we had a couple of initial inquiries, I suppose probably around May or June, people started to think about it a little bit more and kind of open up the idea of how we can do it. So that's why we started these live video sessions. So our normal training is in a classroom. You'd have Anne who would be popping around to see you. You'd sit in the room and we'd all chat through the different scenarios and do the different equipment and whatever the training session would be. So it's very, very interactive, very conversation style. We had to adapt. So we had to figure out how can we do the best quality of training to keep everybody safe, but also do the same quality that we would normally do, so you still have that conversation style. Now today's been a little bit different, so you've just had me and Cal chatting rather than you all chatting in person and video. But I think doing these sessions has opened up the possibility of how we can do them going forward. And I suppose even for locations that are a bit more remote, it's harder to get everybody together, especially in like home care types of services where you don't maybe have all your staff coming together at the same time. This is now kind of an option that we can do. So it depends on the session and depends on your service and what you're interested in and what you need. But it just shows there's a bit more options, and the uptake has been in the last month or two, it's getting back to normal sort of levels of training. So
it's sorry to interrupt.
I think I was rambling.
We do on Zoom. It's actually worked really well. That we're developing a much more interactive approach as we've got more used to it as well after adapting. But use things like the breakout rooms, so people go off and do group work, and it becomes far more interactive then. Today's like a sort of a bit of a lecture kind of a session just to give you a taster, but then we use whiteboards and people can actually write on the whiteboards, and if people are shyer, they can use the chat option. And we've had a lot of feedback to say that people who maybe don't like being in a classroom setting have felt more comfortable being in their own environment doing the Zoom training. So it's sort of worked in lots of different ways. It's been quite interesting actually. But
yeah, I've been surprised. I mean, we were thinking this was a temporary measure, that we wouldn't kind of carry on the online option as soon as lockdown's over. But actually now we're thinking we probably will keep it as an option. We'll go back to face-to-face training as soon as we can and as soon as it's safe. But I think we'll keep this as an option because, like you said, Anne, the feedback has been that people are more comfortable. They're a bit more sometimes open to some of the conversations. So maybe we can do a bit of a hybrid.
And they get their own choice of coffee in the morning as well. Rather than
Exactly.
It's always a bonus. Yeah.
That's it. Richard's just added a comment. I'll just grab. Home care can be challenging for training, so we're keen to look at new methods. Yeah, this is exactly it. Yeah. So the different services and the different options. It's good to just see what else can we do and what would be the best way to train your staff in your service for the people that you support. So drop me an email after this, Richard. We'll have a chat. I think that's everything. That seems to be all the questions. Thanks very much, Anne. That was really, really good. Sorry, the video qualities for some of the clips weren't great. What I'll do is I'll put them in the email when I send out the course notes afterwards. So you'll have a link to our brand new YouTube channel with some of our videos on it. We've been recording these sessions as well, so you'll be able to see some of the clips from what we've talked about today and on our previous 2 sessions. So, go and have a look. But I think that's everything. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today. It was a really good chat as well, and good information shared and some good questions there at the end. So if you need any other information about our full courses or any questions or anything, you can visit our website, which is www.trust-care.co.uk. But as I said, I'll email out the notes and everything, so you can also drop me an email or give me a call if you want to have a chat about anything. So I think that's us. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.